The next section that we're going to talk about is ray tracing. Now, ray tracing is going to enable you to cast accurate shadows through partially transparent surfaces, and it's also going to allow you to see real reflections and also refractions. So if we just look at this object here, go to its attribute editor under the render stats, you'll notice visible and reflections and visible and refractions is on by default. So if you don't want that particular object to be included in a ray trace, you can actually turn those off. And in fact, that will actually speed up your render if they're not included in the ray trace. So I'm just going to leave those on. Let's look at the material that's assigned to this object. Now, if we just move down this Phong material, there's a section called Ray Trace Options. So let's just look at a couple of the attributes here. If I turn on refractions, what refractions are basically just the way the light bends as it hits a semi-transparent surface. So it's actually what's going to give you the distortion of an object that's behind a semi-transparent surface. Just helps to add a lot of realism. Now, the refractive index is at 1 right now, so you'll need to actually make that higher than 1 in order to see the refractions. The other thing that you'll need to do is make sure that this is at least semi-transparent. Now, there's also something here called the reflection limit, and that's going to be the number of times that an object is going to be reflected. So right now, this object is going to be reflected once. We can actually have it bounce off and be reflected again just by changing that to 2 and so on. Okay, so that's a limit for the reflections. And the refraction limit here, what that is the number of times the ray will pass through a semi-transparent surface and back to the camera. So if we have a ray that goes through a surface that has 2 sides, we're going to have to make sure that our refraction limit is 3. So basically count the number of semi-transparent surfaces and then add 1. Now this works in conjunction with the render globals. Just under ray tracing quality, we've turned on ray tracing. Now what happens is Maya is going to use the lower of the 2 values here. So we've got reflections at 1 here, and our reflection limit is 1 here. If we make this 2 for this material, Maya will actually use 1. It's going to use the lower value of the 2. Likewise for the refraction. So if we have a refraction limit of, let's say, 8 here, and it's 6 on the render globals, it's going to use the 6. Okay, and vice versa. If we have, let's say, we have 5 here, and we have a refraction limit of 1 here, Maya is going to use the lower of the 2 values. It's going to use 1. So it's just something to be aware of when you are ray tracing. Sometimes what will happen is when you ray trace, your object will look like it's black, and that's because your refraction limit is not high enough. So it could be one of these 2 values is actually lower than it should be. I just want to point out the shadows. It's going to create a directional light here. Okay, and we'll look at its attribute editor, shadows. And I'm going to turn on use ray trace shadows. And let's look at the ray depth limit. Now what this is the number of transparent surfaces that Maya will go through in order to see a shadow cast on an opaque surface. So let's say we had a bowl of fruit in a glass bowl on a glass table. That was then the glass part of the table was on top of a wooden part of a table. If we wanted to see the shadow of the fruit on the wooden table, we're actually going through a number of transparent surfaces. Okay, so the shadow is going to have to go through a number of transparent surfaces. So what you have to do in that case is you have to count the number of transparent surfaces and add 1. So let's say we've got 2 transparent surfaces that are, that our object has to go through in order to cast a shadow on an opaque surface. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the 2, add 1, and that's going to be our limit. So in terms of the render globals, notice our ray depth limit here is 3 for the light, but our shadows attribute is 2 here. So Maya is going to take the lower value of the 2. Again, it's going to take the 2. So you're going to want to be careful. Okay, same thing. If this is at 1 and this is at 5, it's going to take the 1. So that's if your shadows aren't showing up past the past the transparent surfaces, then you're probably going to want to change your ray depth limit here or your shadows here.